In January 1981, a 1-year-old baby girl was left at an Arizona church by two women who claimed they were part of a nomadic religious group. The women said the baby's parents had joined their cult and wanted to give her up. Then they vanished, never to return. For over 40 years, that little girl, raised as Holly Miller, had no idea who she really was or what happened to her birth parents. She didn't know that her real name was Holly Marie Clouse, or that her grandparents had been searching for her since the day she disappeared. She had no idea that her parents' bodies had been found in the woods of Texas just months after she was abandoned, murdered under mysterious circumstances that investigators still can't fully explain. The truth about what happened during those final days would remain buried for decades, hidden within the twisted world of a doomsday cult that believed the end of the world was coming. Before we dive into this incredible story, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe for more true crime cases that will keep you on the edge of your seat. This video discusses a case involving violence, cult activity, and sensitive content. Viewer discretion is advised. Let's go back to 1979. Tina Gail Linn was 20 years old, full of life, with bright eyes and long dark hair. She had grown up in Florida, in a loving family that centered around strong Christian values. Her parents, Donna and Leroy Linn, had raised their children in the church, teaching them about faith, family, and community. Tina was close to her family, especially her mother, Donna. They talked regularly, shared their dreams, and supported each other through everything. That year, Tina met Harold Dean Clouse Jr., who went by Dean. He was 21, a gentle soul from New Smyrna Beach, Florida. Dean came from a similar background. His parents, Harold Dean Clouse Sr. and Cheryl Clouse, were devoted Christians who had instilled those same values in their son. When Tina and Dean met, there was an instant connection. They shared the same faith, the same dreams of building a life together, the same desire to make a difference in the world. Their relationship moved quickly, as young love often does. Within months, they were talking about marriage, about starting a family, about the future that stretched out before them, like an open road. Both sets of parents were thrilled. The Linns and the Clouses welcomed each new milestone, the engagement, the wedding plans, the news that would make them grandparents. In late 1979, Tina discovered she was pregnant. The young couple was overjoyed. Dean promised Tina he would be the best father he could be. Tina called her mother with the news, her voice bubbling with excitement. Donna could hear the happiness radiating through the phone line. They talked about baby names, about nursery colors, about all the little moments they would share once the baby arrived. On January 6, 1980, Holly Marie Clouse came into the world. She was a beautiful baby girl with her mother's dark hair and her father's gentle features. Tina and Dean were over the moon. They spent hours just watching her sleep, marveling at her tiny fingers and toes, dreaming about the life they would give her. For the Linns and the Clouses, Holly's arrival was a blessing, a continuation of their family legacy. But even in those early months of joy, something was shifting. Tina and Dean were young, idealistic, and deeply spiritual. They wanted more than just a conventional life. They were searching for something deeper, something more meaningful. They talked about faith constantly, about what it meant to truly live according to God's will, about how so much of modern Christianity seemed watered down, commercialized, disconnected from the radical teachings of Jesus. This wasn't unusual for young people in the late 1970s. America was still reeling from the social upheavals of the previous decade. The Vietnam War had ended, leaving many questioning authority and traditional institutions. The counterculture movement had introduced new ways of thinking about community, spirituality, and purpose. Across the country, young people were leaving their conventional lives behind to join communes, spiritual groups, and alternative communities that promised a return to authentic living. Tina and Dean started attending different churches, searching for something that felt more genuine, more alive. They read books about early Christianity, about the apostles who gave up everything to follow Jesus, about communities that shared everything in common and lived according to radical principles of love and service. Somewhere during this searching, they heard about a group that seemed to embody everything they were looking for. The group called themselves the Christ Family, but they would become known by another name, the House of Prayer for All People. To outsiders, they appeared to be just another religious commune, one of many that dotted the American landscape in the late 1970s and early 1980s. But to those who joined, they offered something powerful, a chance to truly live the teachings of Jesus, to give up the materialism and corruption of modern society, to prepare for the end times that were surely coming. The group was led by a charismatic figure who called himself Lightning Amen. His real name was Charles McHugh Hughes, but within the Christ family he was known simply as Lightning. He preached a message that resonated with seekers like Tina and Dean, that the modern world was irredeemably corrupt, that the end was near, that only those who gave up everything and followed God's true path would be saved. Lightning taught that members should abandon their birth names, names given by parents who lived in the corrupt world, and take on new names, names that reflected their spiritual rebirth. Members would become clarity, gentle, peaceful, wisdom. These weren't just nicknames. They were symbols of transformation, of leaving behind the old self and embracing a new identity within the family. The group lived a nomadic lifestyle, traveling from state to state in a caravan of old vehicles, never staying in one place for too long. They survived on donations, occasional odd jobs, and the generosity of sympathetic churches and communities. Members wore simple robes and sandals, even in winter. They grew their hair and beards long. They owned nothing, no money, no possessions beyond the clothes on their backs and the vehicles they traveled in. To Tina and Dean, it must have seemed like the answer to everything they'd been searching for. Throughout 1980, as Tina and Dean became more involved with the Christ family, the Linns and Clouses noticed changes. The phone calls that had once come regularly started to become less frequent. When Tina did call, she sounded different, more distant, more guarded. She talked about a new community she and Dean had found, about how they were learning to live more simply, more faithfully. Donna Linn tried not to worry. Her daughter was young, exploring her faith, trying to find her place in the world. That was normal, wasn't it? But something in Tina's voice made Donna uneasy. There was a brittleness there, a defensiveness that hadn't been there before. "We've found something real, Mom," Tina would say, "a real community that lives the way Jesus taught." "That's wonderful, honey," Donna would reply, trying to keep her voice light. "When can we see you? When can we see Holly?" The answers became vague. Soon. Maybe in a few months. They were traveling. They were busy with the community. They would visit when they could. Then, in late 1980, the phone calls stopped altogether. Donna tried calling the last number she had for Tina. Disconnected. She reached out to friends who might know where Tina and Dean were living. No one knew. She called churches in the area where they'd last been. No one had seen them. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Every time the phone rang, Donna's heart would leap, hoping it was Tina. Every time the mail came, she searched for a letter, a postcard, anything. But there was nothing. By early 1981, Donna Linn was frantic. This wasn't like Tina. Even when they'd had disagreements, even when Tina was trying to assert her independence, she had always called. She had always let them know she and the baby were okay. For her to go completely silent like this, something was wrong. Donna could feel it in her bones. She filed a missing persons report with the police. They took down the information, but Donna could tell they weren't taking it as seriously as she needed them to. Young people ran off all the time, they said, especially young people involved with religious groups. They'd probably resurface eventually. Most of them did, but Donna knew better. A mother knows. Across the country in Florida, Cheryl and Harold Clouse Sr. were going through the same nightmare. Their son had vanished, along with their daughter-in-law and granddaughter. They'd tried everything to find them, calling everyone they knew, reaching out to authorities, following every lead that went nowhere. Both families were living in limbo, caught between hope and despair, praying that somewhere out there, Tina, Dean, and baby Holly were safe. They had no idea what had already happened, and what they would discover would be far worse than anything they'd imagined. But in January 1981, hundreds of miles away from those worried families, two women walked into a small church in Arizona carrying a baby girl. What they said about that child's parents would set off a mystery that wouldn't be solved for more than 40 years. It was a quiet day at a small church in the community of Yuma, Arizona, in January 1981. The exact date has been lost to time, but what happened that day would become seared into the memories of everyone involved. Two women appeared at the church, and immediately something seemed off about them. They wore the kind of simple, homemade clothing that marked them as different: loose-fitting robes, worn sandals despite the cool weather. Their hair was long and unkempt. They looked like they'd been living rough, traveling from place to place without much care for conventional appearances. But it was what they were carrying that caught everyone's attention: a baby girl, roughly a year old, with dark hair and bright eyes. The women spoke to Pastor Philip McGoldrick and his wife. Their story was simple and devastating. They were members of a religious group that lived a nomadic lifestyle, traveling across the country. The baby's parents, they said, were members of their community, but the parents had decided they wanted to give the child up. The parents felt that the nomadic lifestyle was too difficult for an infant, and they wanted their daughter to have a stable home, a chance at a normal life. The women asked if the church could help find a home for the child. They needed someone who would care for her, raise her in a Christian environment, give her the opportunities her birth parents couldn't provide. Pastor McGoldrick and his wife looked at the baby. She seemed healthy, well-fed, clean. She wasn't crying or distressed, but something about the situation felt strange. Who were these women? What kind of religious group was this? Where exactly were the baby's parents? The women were vague on the details. They didn't give names. They didn't provide any documentation, no birth certificate, no medical records, nothing that would identify the child or her family. They said their group didn't believe in such worldly documents. They lived simply, outside the systems and structures of conventional society. When pressed for more information, the women became evasive. The group moved around a lot, they said. The parents had already moved on. They couldn't say exactly where they were now, but they were certain, absolutely certain, that this was what the parents wanted. The McGoldricks were in an impossible position. Every instinct told them something was wrong. But what could they do? Turn the women away and risk the baby being abandoned somewhere less safe? Call the police and have the women arrested, leaving the child in state custody? They were a church, a place of compassion and service. They wanted to help. So they made a decision that, in hindsight, would complicate everything that came after. They agreed to take the baby in temporarily, to find her a home. The women seemed relieved. They thanked the McGoldricks, gave them a few basic supplies for the baby, and then said something that would haunt investigators for decades. They would check back in later to make sure the child was doing well. Then they left. They never came back. Pastor McGoldrick and his wife weren't in a position to adopt the baby themselves, but they knew families in their congregation who had talked about adoption. Within days, they had found a couple who were willing to take the little girl in. The couple, whose names have been kept private to protect their family, were kind, loving people who desperately wanted a child. When they met the baby, it was love at first sight. She was beautiful, sweet-tempered, and seemed to adapt quickly to her new surroundings. There was just one problem. They had no legal documentation for her. No birth certificate, no proof of identity, no legal pathway to formal adoption. The women who had brought her hadn't provided anything beyond verbal assurance that the parents wanted to give her up. This should have been a red flag. In any normal adoption, there would be paperwork, legal proceedings, documentation to ensure everything was above board. But these were different times. The family wanted to believe the story they'd been told. They wanted to believe they were helping a child whose parents had made a heartbreaking but selfless decision. So they did what they thought was best. They gave the baby a name, Holly Miller, and raised her as their own. They loved her fiercely, provided her with a stable home, made sure she went to school, celebrated her birthdays, tucked her in at night, did all the things parents do. Holly grew up never knowing that she had another family somewhere, grandparents who were desperately searching for her, a history that had been stolen from her before she could even remember. For the family who raised her, there were probably moments of doubt, moments when they wondered about the little girl's origins, but they pushed those thoughts aside. She was their daughter now. They were giving her a good life. Wasn't that what mattered? What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that Holly's real parents hadn't voluntarily given her up at all. On January 12, 1981, just days after baby Holly was left at the church in Arizona, a horrifying discovery was made more than 1,000 miles away in Houston, Texas. 2 bodies were found in a wooded area of Houston. They had been there for some time. The medical examiner would later determine they had been deceased for at least several weeks, possibly longer. The bodies were in an advanced state of decomposition, which made identification extremely difficult. The victims had both died from violence. The details were disturbing, the kind of details that suggested these weren't random killings. This was personal, brutal, deliberate. But who were they? With no identification on the bodies, no wallets, no documents, investigators had to rely on physical characteristics and forensic evidence. They collected fingerprints, dental records, took note of any distinguishing features. They canvassed the area looking for anyone who might have seen something, heard something, knew something. The investigation went nowhere fast. The bodies were entered into missing persons databases. Investigators checked against recent missing persons reports from the Houston area. Nothing matched. They expanded the search to neighboring states. Still nothing. The Jane Doe and John Doe remained unidentified, their case file growing thinner as leads dried up and other cases demanded attention. For months, then years, those 2 bodies remained a mystery. They were buried in unmarked graves, 2 unknown souls whose deaths seemed destined to remain unsolved forever. No one connected them to the baby who had been left at a church in Arizona. Why would they? Arizona and Texas were thousands of miles apart. There was no reason to think the cases were related, but they were. And the truth about what happened in those final weeks of 1980 was darker than anyone could have imagined. In late December 1980 or early January 1981, something strange happened in Daytona Beach, Florida. A car was found abandoned, a car that belonged to Tina and Dean Clouse. The vehicle had been left by 2 women who called themselves Sister Susan, and another name that would later be forgotten. The women told people in the area that they were part of a religious group, that they were just passing through. They left the car and disappeared, presumably hitching rides or finding other transportation to continue their journey. When authorities located the car and traced it back to the Clouses, they contacted Tina's family. Donna Lynn's heart leapt when she got the call. They'd found Tina's car. That meant they'd found Tina, right? Her daughter was okay. She was in Florida. But no, just the car. No Tina, no Dean, no baby Holly. The car was processed for evidence, but it didn't reveal much. Some personal belongings, items that clearly belonged to Tina and Dean, but nothing that explained where they were or why they'd abandoned their vehicle. Donna's hope curdled into dread. Why would Tina leave her car behind? Where was she going? Why hadn't she called? The police took the information seriously now. 2 missing adults, a missing infant, an abandoned vehicle in Florida. This was looking less like young people off finding themselves and more like something had gone terribly wrong. But the trail was cold. The women who'd left the car, Sister Susan and her companion, had vanished. No one knew their real names. No one knew where they'd gone. And Tina, Dean, and Holly remained missing. For the families, it was torture. Not knowing was worse than almost anything. Were they alive? Were they being held somewhere? Had they been in an accident? Had they been murdered? The not knowing gnawed at them day after day, year after year. Donna Linn wouldn't give up. She contacted every agency she could think of, filed reports with multiple jurisdictions, kept the case alive through sheer force of will. She knew something terrible had happened to her daughter. She knew Tina would never just disappear without a word. In Florida, the Clouse family did the same. Harold and Cheryl Sr. became advocates for missing persons, speaking out about their son's disappearance, trying to keep attention on the case. Through the 1980s and 1990s, the case remained unsolved. Periodically, investigators would revisit it, looking for new leads, checking against unidentified remains that turned up in various states. But nothing ever matched. Tina, Dean, and baby Holly seemed to have vanished into thin air. For Donna Linn, every holiday was torture. Every birthday Holly was missing. Every Christmas without her daughter and granddaughter. She kept Tina's room exactly as it had been, hoping, always hoping, that somehow, someday, Tina would walk through that door again. She aged decades in those years. The not-knowing carved lines into her face, turned her hair gray, stole the light from her eyes. But she never stopped looking. She never stopped hoping. The same was true for the Clouse family. They attended conferences for families of missing persons, networked with other families living the same nightmare, shared information with law enforcement agencies across the country. They put up flyers, maintained websites, did everything they could to keep Dean and Tina's names in the public consciousness. But as the decades passed, hope began to fade. People started speaking about Tina and Dean in the past tense, started talking about what might have happened to them, rather than where they might be. The unspoken understanding grew. They were probably deceased. The question wasn't whether they were alive, but whether their bodies would ever be found, whether their families would ever get answers. And Holly? The baby who'd been just 1 year old when she disappeared? Everyone assumed she was gone too. If something had happened to Tina and Dean, it seemed impossible that Holly could have survived. What no one realized was that Holly was alive. She was growing up in Arizona, living a normal life, completely unaware that she had another identity, another family, another story. For 40 years, two parallel stories existed: the family searching for a missing baby and a young woman living a life without knowing she was the answer to their prayers. But in 2022, advances in technology would finally bring those two stories crashing together in a way no one saw coming. By the 2010s, the Clouse-Linn missing persons case was about as cold as a case could get. More than 30 years had passed. The original investigators had retired or moved on. The case files had been digitized and archived, gathering digital dust in databases that law enforcement agencies rarely accessed. But Donna Linn hadn't given up. Now, in her 70s, she still called law enforcement agencies regularly, still asked if there were any updates, still clung to the hope that someday, somehow, she would find out what happened to her daughter and granddaughter. In the Clouse family, the same determination persisted. Dean's sister, Cheryl's niece, and other family members kept the case alive on social media, posting updates, sharing old photos, asking anyone with information to come forward. What they didn't know was that technology was about to change everything. The early 2000s brought a revolution in forensic science. DNA technology had advanced to the point where genetic genealogy, using DNA to trace family relationships, was becoming a powerful tool for solving cold cases. You've probably heard of cases like the Golden State Killer, where investigators used genetic genealogy to identify a suspect who had evaded capture for decades. But the same technology could also be used to identify victims, to match unidentified remains with missing persons, to finally give names to Jane and John Does who had languished in morgues and unmarked graves for years. Organizations like the DNA Doe Project began working on exactly this problem. They specialized in taking DNA from unidentified remains and uploading it to genetic genealogy databases, then building family trees to identify the unknown victims. It was painstaking work requiring expertise in both genetics and genealogical research, but it worked. And in the late 2010s, someone decided to take another look at those two unidentified bodies that had been found in Houston, Texas, back in January 1981. The bodies had been buried, but tissue samples and DNA had been preserved. Advances in DNA extraction meant that even degraded samples could now yield usable genetic information. In 2021, the DNA Doe Project took on the case. They extracted DNA from the preserved samples and uploaded it to GEDmatch, a public genetic genealogy database. Then they started building family trees. The process took months. Genetic genealogists worked backward from the DNA matches, identifying distant cousins, tracing family lines, narrowing down possibilities. It's detective work of the most intricate kind, requiring patience, attention to detail, and a deep understanding of how families connect and diverge over generations. Slowly, a picture began to emerge. The John Doe appeared to be connected to a family from Florida. The genealogists built out the family tree, identifying living relatives, checking against missing persons reports. One name kept appearing, Harold Dean Clouse, Jr. Could it be? The genealogists cross-referenced everything they knew about the John Doe with what they could find out about Dean Clouse. The age matched, the time frame matched, the geographic connections made sense. They did the same with the Jane Doe, building out her family tree from DNA matches. And they found a connection to another family from Florida, the Linns, Tina Gail Linn. The two unidentified bodies that had been found in Houston in 1981 were Dean and Tina Clouse. After more than 40 years, they finally had names. In 2021, law enforcement contacted the families with the news. After all these years, after all the waiting and wondering and hoping against hope, they finally had answers. But they were the worst possible answers. Dean and Tina hadn't run off to start a new life. They hadn't voluntarily disappeared. They had been murdered, their bodies dumped in the woods of Texas, left to be found as Jane and John Doe. For the families, the news was devastating. They had known deep down that this was likely. But knowing and having it confirmed are two different things. The finality of it, the certainty that Tina and Dean would never walk through the door again, that there would be no miraculous reunion, it shattered whatever small fragments of hope they'd been clinging to. Donna Linn was 78 years old. She had spent more than 40 years searching for her daughter, and now she knew Tina had been dead almost the entire time. Dead and unidentified, buried in an unmarked grave while her mother searched for her. The grief was immeasurable. But there was something else, too. A question that immediately rose to the forefront. What about Holly? If Dean and Tina had been murdered in late 1980 or early 1981, what had happened to their baby daughter? Holly would have been just 1 year old. Was there a third body they hadn't found? Had the baby been killed too? Or, and this was the question that kept the families up at night, was there a chance, however small, that Holly had survived? Once Dean and Tina were identified, investigators started pulling together everything they knew about the case. They looked at the abandoned car in Florida. They looked at the timeline of when the couple had last been in contact with family. They searched for any witnesses, any leads, anything that might tell them what had happened in those final weeks. And that's when they found something interesting. Reports of a religious group that Dean and Tina had been involved with, the Christ family. Investigators started digging into the group's history, tracking their movements, looking for connections. They found the report of the abandoned car left by Sister Susan. They found references to the group traveling through Texas in late 1980. And then they found something else, a report, buried in old files, about a baby left at a church in Arizona in January 1981. Could it be? The timing matched. The description matched. A baby girl, approximately 1 year old, left by women who claimed to be from a nomadic religious group. Investigators tracked down the church, tracked down the records from that day in 1981. They interviewed people who had been there, who remembered the women and the baby. And they started trying to figure out what had happened to that child. This was where things got complicated. The baby had been taken in by a family, raised as their own. But there had been no formal adoption, no legal paperwork. The family had essentially taken the child off the books, raising her in their home, without ever officially documenting her existence in the system. This made finding her extremely difficult. Investigators had to trace connections through church records, through people's memories of events that had happened more than 40 years ago. They had to find the family who had taken Holly in, convince them to cooperate, and then, if Holly was still alive, figure out how to tell her that everything she knew about her identity was wrong. As investigators dug deeper into the Christ family, a disturbing picture emerged. This wasn't just some harmless religious commune. The group had a dark history. Lightning Amen, Charles McHugh Hughes, was a charismatic leader who demanded absolute loyalty from his followers. He taught that members must give up everything, their possessions, their identities, their connections to their birth families. They were to be reborn into the Christ family, adopting new names and new lives. The group traveled constantly, moving from state to state in a caravan of decrepit vehicles. They lived on the fringes of society, occasionally stopping at churches or communities to beg for donations. Members wore robes and sandals, grew their hair long, adopted an appearance that deliberately set them apart from mainstream society. But underneath the religious veneer, there were troubling patterns. Former members spoke of manipulation, of psychological control, of members being isolated from outside contacts. Lightning Amen was the absolute authority, and questioning him was forbidden. The group had been linked to various incidents over the years. In the 1970s and early 1980s, they'd been investigated for child neglect, for petty crimes, for behavior that crossed the line from merely eccentric to potentially dangerous. And now, it seemed, they might be connected to murder. Investigators tried to track down former members of the Christ family, people who might have been traveling with the group in late 1980. They wanted to know who Sister Susan was. They wanted to know what had happened in those final weeks before Dean and Tina's bodies were found. But the trail was frustratingly cold. Many former members had adopted new identities after leaving the group, disappearing into normal lives and leaving their cult experience behind. Others had died in the intervening decades. And those who were still alive often didn't want to talk about their time in the Christ family. It was a painful period they'd tried to forget. Still, investigators persisted. They found a few former members who remembered Dean and Tina joining the group. They remembered the young couple with a baby. They remembered that Dean and Tina had seemed committed, devoted to Lightning's teachings, eager to prove themselves worthy of the family. But then, something had changed. Piecing together the timeline from witness statements and evidence, investigators developed a theory about what had happened in those final weeks of 1980. Dean and Tina had been traveling with the Christ family, moving from state to state. At some point, they ended up in Texas. The group often split up, with small subgroups traveling in different directions before reuniting later. This made them harder to track, harder for authorities to monitor. In Texas, something went wrong. The exact details remain murky, but former members suggested there had been tension. Some said that Dean and Tina had started questioning the group's teachings. Others said there had been conflict over the baby, that Dean and Tina wanted to provide better care for Holly, wanted to stay in one place for a while, wanted to reconnect with their families. Lightning Amen didn't tolerate dissent. Members who questioned him were often ostracized, punished, or forced out of the group. But what happened to Dean and Tina was far worse than excommunication. The theory investigators developed was chilling. Dean and Tina had been murdered, likely by members of the Christ family, possibly on Lightning's orders. Their bodies had been dumped in the woods of Houston, left to decompose beyond recognition. But what about Holly? Had the killers spared the baby? Had they decided that a 1-year-old was innocent, not responsible for her parents' transgressions? Or was it simpler than that? Maybe Holly was leverage. Maybe she was kept alive to keep Dean and Tina compliant until the very end. Or maybe the killers simply didn't have the heart to murder a baby. Whatever the reason, Holly had survived. And after Dean and Tina were gone, the women in the Christ family, likely including Sister Susan, had driven to Arizona with the baby. They'd left her at a church telling a story about willing parents, then vanished before anyone could ask too many questions. It was a way to dispose of an inconvenient witness without committing another murder. It gave Holly a chance at life, even if that life was built on lies. By 2022, investigators had a pretty good idea of what had happened. But proving it was another matter entirely. Dean and Tina's murders were more than 40 years old. Physical evidence had long since degraded. Witnesses' memories were unreliable after so much time, and many of the people who might have been involved were likely dead. Lightning Amen, Charles McHugh Hughes, had died in 2017. He would never face justice for whatever role he'd played in the murders. Other members of the Christ family from that era were scattered, their whereabouts unknown. Even if investigators could find them, building a prosecutable case after 40 years would be nearly impossible. So the focus shifted from prosecution to something else: finding Holly and reuniting her with her birth family. That was going to require its own kind of detective work. Investigators now faced a delicate challenge: finding a woman who had been living for more than 40 years under a false identity and telling her that her entire life story was a lie. What they discovered would lead to one of the most emotional reunions in true crime history. By early 2022, investigators had traced the church records and tracked down the family who had taken Holly and back in 1981. This was incredibly sensitive work. The family had raised Holly in good faith, believing they were helping a child whose parents had willingly given her up. They loved her as their own daughter. Now investigators had to tell them that Holly's parents hadn't given her up. They'd been murdered. And that Holly had biological family who had been searching for her for more than 4 decades. The family cooperated, but the emotional weight of the revelation was crushing. They'd done what they thought was right, what they thought was best for a child in need. And in many ways, they had been right. They'd given Holly a stable, loving home, opportunities she might not have had otherwise. But the fact remained: Holly had been stolen from her biological family, her identity erased, her history replaced with a fiction. Through the family who'd raised her, investigators were able to make contact with Holly. By this time, she was 42 years old, living her own life with her own family and career. She'd grown up as Holly Miller, never knowing she'd been born Holly Marie Clouse. Imagine that moment. Imagine investigators sitting down with you and telling you that everything you know about your origins is wrong, that your parents were murdered when you were a baby, that you have an entire biological family, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, who've been searching for you your whole life. Holly's world shattered. Of course, before anything could move forward, there had to be absolute certainty that Holly Miller was actually Holly Marie Clouse. The story fit, the timeline matched. But after 40 years and the trauma both families had been through, no one wanted to risk a mistake. DNA testing was arranged. Samples from Holly were compared with DNA from her biological relatives, her surviving grandparents and other family members on both the Linn and Clouse sides. The wait for results felt eternal. For Holly, it was a surreal limbo between two possible futures. For the families, it was hope and terror in equal measure. What if it wasn't her? What if they'd come so close only to have it ripped away again? But when the results came back, there was no doubt. The DNA was a match. Holly Miller was Holly Marie Clouse. The baby who'd been left at a church in Arizona was the same baby Donna Linn had held and loved, the granddaughter who'd been torn from the family 42 years earlier. She was alive. After all this time, against all odds, she was alive. In June 2022, the news broke publicly. Major news outlets picked up the story. Baby found alive after 42 years. Family reunited after 4 decades. The miracle reunion that seemed impossible. For the Linn family, the emotion was overwhelming. Donna Linn, now 81 years old, was going to meet her granddaughter for the first time since Holly was a baby. Donna had never given up hope, never stopped searching, never stopped believing that somehow, someday, she would find Holly. But Donna was also dealing with the complicated grief of having her worst fears confirmed. Her daughter Tina was dead, had been dead for more than 40 years. The reunion with Holly was joyous, but it was also wrapped in layers of loss and trauma. For the Clouse family, the emotions were similarly complex. They were thrilled to find Holly alive, but devastated to lose Dean again, to have his murder confirmed after so many years of uncertainty. And for Holly, the experience was perhaps most complicated of all. She was meeting biological family for the first time, people who were strangers but also connected to her by blood and history. She was learning about parents she'd never known, about a life she might have had, about a history that had been stolen from her. At the same time, she had the family who'd raised her, the people she called mom and dad, the life she'd actually lived. Those relationships were real too. That love was real too. The reunion was organized carefully, with support from law enforcement and victim advocates. In June 2022, Holly met her biological family for the first time in 4 decades. Photos from that meeting show the raw emotion of the moment. Linn, elderly and frail, embracing her granddaughter, tears flowing freely, hands clutching hands, a family torn apart being stitched back together, even though the wounds would never fully heal. "You look just like your mother," Donna told Holly, her voice breaking. "Just like her." Holly looked at the photos of Tina, seeing her own features reflected back at her. The dark hair, the shape of the eyes, the smile. She was looking at a stranger who was also her mother, a woman she'd never known, but who'd given her life. "I wish I'd known her," Holly said. It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of 42 years of stolen time, of moments that should have been, but never were. The public reunion was beautiful, the kind of moment that makes for feel-good news stories. But the reality was far more complicated. Holly had to process an incredible amount of trauma in a very short time. She had to grieve for parents she'd never known, mourn a life she'd never had, adjust to the knowledge that her entire origin story had been based on lies. She had to integrate this new identity, Holly Marie Clouse, with the person she'd been, Holly Miller, and figure out who she was now. She also had to navigate relationships with 2 families. The family who'd raised her hadn't done anything wrong, and Holly loved them. But now she also had this biological family, these people with legitimate claims to her time, her attention, her love. There's no roadmap for this situation. Therapists who specialize in trauma and identity issues worked with Holly, helping her process the revelations and chart a path forward. But it was hard, exhausting work. Holly gave several interviews in the months after the reunion, speaking publicly about her experience. She talked about the shock of learning the truth, about the complexity of her emotions, about trying to build relationships with her biological family while honoring the family who'd raised her. "I'm grateful I'm alive," she said in one interview. "I'm grateful to the family who raised me and gave me a good life, but I'm also angry at what was taken from me, from my parents, from my grandparents. We lost so much time." That anger was valid. Dean and Tina had been murdered when they were just 21 and 22 years old. They never got to see their daughter grow up, never got to celebrate her birthdays, never got to meet her children, if she had any. Their lives were stolen from them, and Holly's life with them was stolen from her. Linn had spent the last 42 years of her life searching, grieving, hoping. She got her granddaughter back, but she would never get her daughter back. And the years she could have spent with Holly, watching her grow up, being part of her life, were gone forever. The family who raised Holly had to reckon with the fact that their daughter's origin story was built on murder and lies. They'd done nothing wrong, had acted with love and good intentions, but the foundation of their family had cracks they'd never known existed. Everyone involved was a victim. That's what made this case so heartbreaking. While the family reunion dominated headlines, investigators continued working the murder case. They wanted justice for Dean and Tina, even if it came more than 40 years too late. They focused on identifying the women who'd left Holly at the church, particularly Sister Susan. They believed these women had direct knowledge of the murders, might have even been present when they occurred. They interviewed more former members of the Christ family, looking for anyone who might have information about what happened in Texas in late 1980. Some former members cooperated, sharing what they remembered. Others refused to talk, still afraid of repercussions, even though Lightning Amen was dead. The investigation was complicated by the passage of time and by the nature of the Christ family itself. The group's nomadic lifestyle and rejection of conventional record-keeping meant there were huge gaps in documentation. Members had used assumed names, traveled without leaving paper trails, existed in the margins of society where their movements went largely unnoticed and unrecorded. Still, investigators made progress. By late 2022, they had identified several persons of interest, former members of the Christ family who had been traveling with the group at the time of the murders. Some of these individuals were deceased. Others were elderly, living quiet lives, seemingly disconnected from their cult past. But knowing who might have been involved and proving it in a court of law were two very different things. The physical evidence was gone. The crime scene had been compromised decades ago. Witnesses' memories were unreliable. And any confessions would be challenged on grounds of age, memory, and credibility. As of the last updates in 2023 and 2024, the murder investigation remains open. Law enforcement agencies in Texas continue to work the case, following leads when they emerge, hoping for a breakthrough that might lead to charges. The families have been vocal advocates for justice. They've done media interviews, appeared on true crime podcasts, shared their story widely in hopes that someone, somewhere, might come forward with information. They want the people responsible for Dean and Tina's murders to be held accountable. They want the full story of what happened in those final days. They want closure, though they know that true closure might be impossible. Holly has joined them in this quest. She's spoken publicly about wanting justice for the parents she never knew, about honoring their memory by ensuring their killers don't get away with it. But there's also a recognition of reality. It's been more than 40 years. The likelihood of a successful prosecution diminishes with each passing year. Lightning. Amen. The most likely person to have ordered the murders is dead. Other key figures from that era are dying off. Time is running out. Yet even without a trial, the case raises haunting questions about the Christ family, about what really happened in Texas, and about whether there are other victims, other bodies, other stolen children that have never been found. The official theory, that Dean and Tina were murdered by members of the Christ family, possibly on Lightning's orders, fits the available evidence. But the exact circumstances remain frustratingly unclear. One theory is that Dean and Tina had decided to leave the group. They'd seen enough of the cult lifestyle, realized it wasn't what they wanted for Holly, and announced their intention to return to their families. In Lightning's twisted worldview, leaving the family was the ultimate betrayal. Former members have said that Lightning considered defectors to be enemies, people who could expose the group's practices and bring law enforcement attention. If Dean and Tina tried to leave, they might have been seen as a threat. And in the isolated, paranoid world of the Christ family, threats were eliminated. Another theory is darker, that Dean and Tina witnessed something, a crime, an abuse, something that made them question everything. They threatened to go to the police to report what they'd seen, and for that, they had to be silenced. A third possibility is that the murders weren't premeditated at all. Maybe there was an argument, a conflict that escalated. Maybe Dean and Tina pushed back against Lightning's authority, and things spiraled out of control. In the heat of the moment, members of the group killed them, then had to figure out what to do with the evidence, including baby Holly. We may never know which scenario is closest to the truth. Those who know aren't talking, and those who might talk are mostly dead. One of the most disturbing aspects of this case is the question it raises. Were Dean and Tina the only victims? The Christ family operated for decades, from the 1960s through the 1990s. Hundreds of people passed through the group during that time. Most left voluntarily, simply walking away and rebuilding their lives. But what about the others? Former members have spoken about people who disappeared from the group under mysterious circumstances. Someone who was there one day and gone the next, with vague explanations about them moving on or going their separate way. At the time, most members didn't question it. The group's nomadic lifestyle meant people were constantly coming and going. But now, with the knowledge that at least 2 members were murdered, those disappearances take on a more sinister cast. Were there others? Are there more bodies out there buried in woods across the country, never identified, their families still searching? Investigators have looked into this possibility, cross-referencing missing persons reports from the 1970s and 1980s with known movements of the Christ family. There are some intriguing matches, people who went missing around the time the group was in their area, but nothing definitive, nothing that rises to the level of evidence. Still, the question haunts those who've studied the case. The Christ family's rejection of conventional records, their constant movement, their isolation from mainstream society, it all created conditions where people could disappear without a trace. One of the most frustrating loose ends is the identity of the women who left Holly at the church. Investigators believe they know who Sister Susan was, a former member whose real identity they've uncovered through painstaking research. But as of the last public updates, no charges have been filed. The legal situation is complicated. What crime exactly did these women commit? They didn't murder Dean and Tina, or if they did, there's no evidence proving it. They abandoned a child, yes, but they left her at a church where she would be found and cared for. In some jurisdictions, that might be prosecuted as child abandonment. In others, particularly given the passage of time, prosecutors might decline to press charges. There's also the question of what these women knew. Were they active participants in the murders? Did they help dispose of the bodies? Or were they simply followers who did what they were told, taking Holly away from a crime scene and leaving her somewhere safe because they couldn't bear to hurt a child? The families want answers from these women. They want to know what happened in those final days, what Dean and Tina said, whether they knew what was coming, whether they suffered. These are terrible questions, but the not knowing is somehow worse. If Sister Susan and her companion are still alive, they're living with the weight of what they know. They're the keepers of secrets that families have been desperate to uncover for more than 40 years. Every day they stay silent is another day the Linns and Clouses live without full closure. The Christ family officially disbanded in the 1990s, but its legacy is one of broken families, trauma, and unanswered questions. Former members have spoken about the psychological damage inflicted by Lightning's teachings, the difficulty of reintegrating into normal society, the shame and confusion that comes from having been part of something so destructive. Many former members have expressed guilt about not speaking up sooner, about not questioning what was happening, about following a leader who demanded absolute obedience. They've talked about the cognitive dissonance of believing they were doing God's work while witnessing abuse, neglect, and worse. The Christ family case is a reminder of how cults operate. They isolate members from outside support systems, create an us versus them mentality, demand loyalty above all else, and punish dissent. In that environment, normal moral reasoning breaks down. People do things they would never do in ordinary circumstances. Lightning. Amen was a master manipulator who used religion as a tool for control. He created a world where his word was law, where questioning him was equivalent to questioning God, where loyalty to the family superseded all other bonds, including the bond between parents and children. Dean and Tina fell victim to that manipulation. They were young, idealistic, searching for meaning. They wanted to live a more authentic Christian life, and Lightning promised them that. By the time they realized what they'd gotten into, it was too late. In the aftermath of the reunion, Holly has become an advocate for other victims of cults and child abduction. She's spoken about the importance of DNA databases, of not giving up on missing persons cases even decades later, of the need for support systems for people who discover traumatic truths about their origins. Her survival is remarkable. Against all odds, she made it out of a situation that should have killed her. The women who left her at that church, whatever their motivations, gave her a chance at life. The family who took her in loved her and raised her well. She grew into a functioning, healthy adult despite the trauma embedded in her origin story. But Holly has also been candid about the challenges. The discovery of her true identity hasn't been a fairy tale ending. It's been complicated, messy, painful. She's had to rebuild her understanding of herself while navigating relationships with two families, dealing with media attention, and processing the murder of parents she never knew. "Some days I'm okay," she said in a recent interview. Some days I'm angry at everyone, at the people who killed my parents, at the cult, at the universe for putting me in this situation. I'm working through it, but it's not a straight line. Healing isn't linear. That honesty is powerful. Holly's story isn't just about a miraculous reunion. It's about the long-term impact of violence, the complexity of identity, the work required to heal from trauma. Even with all we now know, crucial questions remain. Who actually killed Dean and Tina? Was it Lightning himself? Other members of the Christ family? Someone else entirely? Why were they killed? Was it about leaving the cult? Something they witnessed? A conflict gone wrong? Were there other victims? Are there more bodies out there? More families searching for answers? What did the women who left Holly at the church know? Were they accomplices to murder or simply pawns in a larger scheme? These questions may never be fully answered. The principals are dead or silent. The evidence is gone. Time has erased too much. But the case has brought some measure of closure. Dean and Tina have their names back. They've been laid to rest properly, with their families present. Holly knows who she is, where she came from, what happened to her parents. It's not justice, but it's something. And perhaps most importantly, the story has exposed the dark reality of the Christ family and ensured that Dean and Tina Clouse will be remembered, not as forgotten Jane and John Doe, but as young parents whose lives were stolen far too soon. The story of Holly Marie Clouse is one of the most extraordinary cases in recent true crime history. It's a story about the power of persistence, the advances in technology that make the impossible possible, and the enduring strength of family bonds even across decades of separation. Donna Linn spent 42 years searching for her granddaughter, never giving up hope even when everyone else had moved on. That determination, that refusal to let her daughter and granddaughter be forgotten, ultimately led to the breakthrough. Without her advocacy, without her constant pressure on law enforcement to keep the case active, Dean and Tina might have remained John and Jane Doe forever. Holly might never have known her true identity. The case is also a stark reminder of the dangers of cults, of charismatic leaders who exploit people's spiritual yearning for their own purposes. The Christ family destroyed lives, tore families apart, and, if investigators' theories are correct, got away with murder for more than 40 years. Lightning Amen never faced justice for his role in creating that toxic environment. For Holly, the journey continues. She's building relationships with her biological family while maintaining bonds with the family who raised her. She's learning about her parents through photos, stories, and memories shared by relatives. She's creating a new narrative of who she is, one that honors both Holly Miller and Holly Marie Clouse. And she's advocating for others, for missing persons whose cases have gone cold, for families still searching for answers, for victims of cults who need support and understanding. Dean and Tina Clouse were just 21 and 22 when they died. They should have had decades ahead of them, should have watched their daughter grow up, should have seen grandchildren, should have lived full, rich lives. Instead, they were murdered and forgotten, their bodies left in the woods, their names erased. But now they're remembered, now their story is told. And now their daughter, the baby they died trying to protect, knows who they were and what they meant. It's not the ending anyone wanted, but it's an ending nonetheless. And sometimes, in cases like this, that's the best we can hope for. Thank you so much for watching. If this case moved you, please leave a like, share this video, and subscribe to Seek Stories. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on this incredible case. And if you or someone you know has information about the murders of Dean and Tina Clouse, please contact the Texas authorities. Justice may be delayed, but it's never too late to do what's right.